The brain is a remarkably adaptive organ, constantly reshaping itself in response to the stimuli it receives, a phenomenon known as neuroplasticity. Self-directed neuroplasticity refers to the ability of individuals to consciously influence this rewiring process through focused mental activity, and one of the most powerful tools to harness this is intentional self-talk. When you deliberately choose the language you use internally, you begin to influence the structure and function of neural circuits. This process doesn't rely on external input alone. Rather, it is driven by the internal dialogue you engage in every day. By repeatedly reinforcing empowering beliefs and thoughts, you are essentially training your brain to adopt new patterns of thinking and behaving. The brain responds to these patterns by strengthening synaptic connections that support the new mindset you're cultivating. When you talk to yourself in ways that are constructive, goal-oriented, and emotionally resonant, you activate specific neural pathways associated with motivation, confidence, and executive function. Over time, these neural pathways become more efficient, more dominant, and more readily accessible. It's not just about thinking positively, it's about engaging with your thoughts in a way that directs your brain's plastic potential toward growth and resilience. This means choosing to reframe setbacks, intentionally acknowledging your capabilities, and repeating statements that reinforce your desired identity. For example, saying to yourself, "I am capable of handling uncertainty," activates a very different neural pattern than "I don't know what to do." In the first case, you're telling your brain to prepare for action. In the second, you're reinforcing helplessness. Additionally, self-directed neuroplasticity is enhanced when the language used in self-talk is specific and emotionally charged. The brain is more likely to encode information that is tied to a strong emotional response. That's why statements that reflect your values or connect to your goals have a greater impact. Saying, "I'm becoming the kind of person who follows through on commitments," can elicit a more profound neural engagement than a vague affirmation like, "I'm doing better." The specificity and relevance of the message matters. Emotional tone, repetition, and belief all contribute to whether your self-talk produces measurable changes in brain function. It's also important to consider that this process is not instantaneous. Neuroplastic change requires consistency and repetition. Just like building muscle requires repeated stress and recovery, building mental resilience and focus requires consistent reinforcement of adaptive internal dialogue. Speaking to yourself intentionally over a period of 4 days, for instance, is long enough to begin altering your mental baseline, especially if done with conscious effort and emotional investment. These first few days can serve as a catalyst, setting into motion a longer-term habit loop. Each time you talk to yourself with clarity, optimism, and direction, you're shaping the architecture of your brain in real time. By learning to speak to yourself like someone who is both compassionate and demanding, like a coach who sees your potential and insists you rise to it, you create an internal environment where growth is not only possible, but inevitable. This self-generated influence is perhaps one of the most underestimated forces in behavioral change. You are, in essence, training your brain to recognize and prefer thoughts that support your best self. And it all begins with the conscious, disciplined decision to use your voice internally and externally to sculpt your mind. The way you talk to yourself forms the foundation of your internal narrative, which shapes your perception of reality, emotional responses, and decision-making. This internal dialogue, often occurring automatically, becomes the lens through which you interpret events, setbacks, and successes. Cognitive framing is the psychological process of interpreting experiences through specific mental filters, and it plays a critical role in determining your emotional state and behavioral choices. When you learn to control and direct your internal dialogue, you also learn to shift these cognitive frames, redefining problems as challenges, failures as feedback, and discomfort as a necessary part of growth. The power of internal dialogue lies in its subtle but consistent influence. Thoughts that are repeated regularly become beliefs, and beliefs determine how you act under pressure, how resilient you are in the face of adversity, and how confident you feel when pursuing your goals. For example, when you continually tell yourself, "I can't do this," your brain begins to treat that statement as a fact rather than an opinion. This activates neural pathways that reinforce avoidance, anxiety, and low motivation. On the other hand, If your internal dialogue shifts to statements like, I don't know how yet, but I can learn, you open the door to curiosity and persistence. The framing of the situation moves from limitation to possibility. Importantly, your internal dialogue doesn't need to be artificially positive to be effective. What matters is that it's constructive, realistic, and oriented towards solutions. Telling yourself everything is perfect when it clearly isn't may lead to cognitive dissonance and frustration. But saying things are hard right now and I'm taking action to improve them validates your current reality while still directing your focus forward. This type of balanced self-talk fosters psychological flexibility, which is strongly correlated with resilience and long-term well-being. It's not about ignoring problems. It's about approaching them with a mindset that enhances problem solving and emotional regulation. When you develop the habit of consciously reframing your thoughts, you begin to build a sense of agency. You recognize that while you may not control all external circumstances, you do have control over how you interpret and respond to them. This agency is empowering and stabilizing. It reduces reactivity and allows for a more thoughtful engagement with life's challenges. Over time, the brain adapts to this new way of thinking. Cognitive framing becomes more fluid, less rigid, and more adaptive. You start to see effort as part of mastery, stress as a signal for growth, and setbacks as data rather than defeat. A key aspect of transforming internal dialogue is awareness. Before you can change the way you talk to yourself, you must first notice what you're already saying. This involves catching those automatic, often subconscious, thoughts and evaluating whether they serve your goals or hinder them. Once you become aware of disempowering narratives, such as perfectionism, self-doubt, or fear-based thinking, you can begin to consciously replace them with narratives that align with who you want to become. This doesn't mean ignoring discomfort. It means contextualizing it through a lens of purpose. Over just a few days of deliberate practice, the effects can begin to manifest. You may find that you are more mentally prepared to start your day, that you recover faster from stress, and that you engage with your goals more consistently. The shift in internal dialogue is not just psychological, it has neurobiological consequences. Positive reframing and constructive self-talk activate regions of the brain associated with planning, emotion regulation, and long-term goal pursuit. You begin to rewire your brain toward patterns of thought and behavior that support lasting change. And this transformation starts not with dramatic action, but with the quiet, disciplined decision to change the way you speak to yourself. When you engage in intentional and emotionally charged self-talk, you can stimulate powerful neurochemical changes in the brain, particularly the release of dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that plays a central role in motivation, reward, attention, and the drive to pursue goals. It is often associated with pleasurable experiences, but more accurately, it's involved in the anticipation of reward and the willingness to take action. The act of speaking to yourself in ways that affirm progress, reinforce effort, and highlight potential, especially when done with enthusiasm and conviction, can create a biochemical signal that reinforces the behavior you want to repeat. Over time, this process strengthens neural circuits related to goal-directed behavior. Dopamine is often misunderstood as something that gets released only in response to external rewards like praise, success, or achieving a goal. However, research shows that dopamine is also released when we imagine a positive outcome or take a small step toward a valued goal. This means you can generate your own dopamine by reinforcing encouraging and purposeful self-talk, especially when you link it to specific, meaningful actions. For example, saying, I'm showing up for myself by completing this task, while actually beginning that task can create a loop in which action and affirmation reinforce one another through a dopamine response. This creates a forward, driving momentum that helps you stay focused and energized even through difficult or repetitive tasks. When you talk to yourself with emotion, meaning you truly feel what you're saying, the effect is even more pronounced. Emotionally intense affirmations activate the limbic system, particularly the amygdala, which increases the salience of the message and helps encode it in long-term memory. This emotional charge doesn't need to be extreme. Even moderate emotional engagement can enhance the effectiveness of your self-talk. The more real and vivid your internal language feels, the more likely it is to create a measurable neurochemical shift. That's why vague or flat self-statements often don't work. They lack the emotional energy needed to engage your neurobiology. The key is repetition combined with emotional intensity. It's not enough to say something once. The brain responds to repeated patterns, and the more frequently you affirm a thought, especially with strong emotional backing, the more deeply it becomes embedded in your neural architecture. Think of it as carving a path through the brain. Each repetition strengthens the trail, and over time, the brain begins to prefer that route over others. This is how thought patterns become habits, and habits become identity. Saying, "I can handle this," not just when things are easy, but especially when things are difficult, teaches your brain to associate challenge with capability instead of stress or fear. It's also important to recognize that dopamine is context sensitive. It is not simply about feeling good. It is about predicting positive outcomes and preparing the body to act. When your self-talk focuses on progress rather than perfection, statements like, "I'm improving," or "I'm building momentum," you are leveraging dopamine's true power. You're training your brain to associate effort with reward, which makes consistent action more likely over time. This also increases your resilience because even when progress is slow or setbacks occur, your dopamine system remains engaged by the process, not just the outcome. Over the course of just 4 days, if you consistently engage in intentional, emotionally resonant self-talk that reinforces effort, growth, and direction, you can begin to shift your neurochemical state. You may notice increased energy, clearer focus, and a greater willingness to engage with tasks that once felt overwhelming. These aren't just motivational effects. They are neurological adaptations driven by how you choose to speak to yourself. By taking ownership of your internal dialogue, you gain influence over your brain chemistry, and with that, your behavior and ultimately your outcomes. The prefrontal cortex is the region of the brain responsible for high-level cognitive functions such as planning, decision making, goal setting, impulse control, and regulating attention. When you use intentional and structured language in your self-talk, you directly engage this part of the brain, activating the neural circuits that govern your ability to think rationally, solve problems, and take deliberate action. This is why the specific language you use with yourself matters so much. Vague, emotionally reactive, or self-defeating thoughts often bypass the prefrontal cortex and instead activate more primitive brain regions like the amygdala, which are responsible for fear and emotional reactivity. However, when your self-talk is intentional, grounded, and purposeful, it acts as a signal to the prefrontal cortex to take control of your actions and attention. Speaking to yourself with clarity such as, "I am going to focus on one step at a time," or "This situation is hard, but I can handle it by doing X," engages a very different cognitive and neural process than saying, "I'm overwhelmed," or "This is too much." The first set of statements activates neural pathways associated with executive function, helping you organize your thoughts, reduce cognitive noise, and engage in problem-solving behaviors. Over time, the brain adapts to the frequency of these thought patterns, reinforcing the neural circuitry that supports self-control, planning, and focus. This self-directed engagement of the prefrontal cortex is not automatic. It must be cultivated through conscious repetition. The brain is highly sensitive to patterns, and every time you respond to stress or uncertainty with structured and supportive language, you are reinforcing your brain's ability to stay calm under pressure. In contrast, if your default self-talk is chaotic, fearful, or self-critical, those neural pathways become stronger, making it more difficult to access higher-level thinking when you need it most. The deliberate use of constructive internal dialogue trains your brain to prioritize cognition over emotion, especially during moments of challenge. In neuroscience, this type of top-down regulation, where the prefrontal cortex regulates emotional and behavioral responses, is a core mechanism of self-mastery. It allows you to pause before reacting, to assess the situation clearly, and to choose your next move with intention. One of the simplest ways to train this system is by starting your day with clear, forward-focused self-statements. These statements might include affirmations like, "Today I will control what I can and let go of what I can't," or "My focus is my power, and I'm directing it where it matters most." When you vocalize these statements, even silently, you are reinforcing the prefrontal networks responsible for intentional behavior. In addition to cognitive benefits, Activating the prefrontal cortex through structured self-talk has emotional and physiological advantages. This brain region has strong connections to areas responsible for emotional regulation, such as the anterior cingulate cortex and parts of the limbic system. This means that when your self-talk helps you make sense of your experience, your emotional state becomes more regulated. You feel more in control, less reactive, and more able to act in alignment with your long-term goals. Practicing this over just a few days can yield noticeable effects. You may begin to respond to setbacks with more composure, notice a clearer thought process when making decisions, or find it easier to shift focus back to what matters. These are signs that the prefrontal cortex is taking a more active role in guiding your behavior. While the brain structure won't transform overnight, the functional activation of these higher circuits can begin within hours and strengthen with consistent practice. Ultimately, the words you choose to say to yourself are not just mental fluff, they are the operating code of your brain. Structured, intentional language doesn't just make you feel better, it enhances your cognitive performance by directing neural resources to the areas of the brain that allow you to lead your own life instead of reacting to it. Through this practice, you become the author of your response, the designer of your direction, and the operator of your most powerful cognitive tools. The way you speak to yourself doesn't just shape your mindset. It has direct physiological effects on your body, particularly in how it regulates stress. One of the key systems involved in stress response is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis. This system controls the release of cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone. While cortisol is essential in short bursts to help you respond to challenges, chronic activation of this system due to negative self-talk, anxiety, or internalized pressure can lead to fatigue, impaired focus, sleep disruption, and even physical illness. Supportive and calming self-talk plays a critical role in regulating this system, helping to return the body to a balanced state and reducing unnecessary stress hormone release. When your inner voice is harsh, critical, or fear-based, the brain perceives it as a threat. Even though the threat isn't external, the internal language can trigger the same stress pathways as a real physical danger. This is known as a psychogenic stressor. Your own thoughts become the cause of a physiological stress response. The amygdala, which detects threats, sends signals that initiate cortisol release, putting your body into a state of fight or flight. However, when you speak to yourself with reassurance and clarity, such as saying, "This is stressful, but I'm safe and in control," or "I can move through this one step at a time," you activate the parasympathetic nervous system, also known as the rest and digest system. This system counteracts stress by calming the heart rate, slowing breathing, and reducing cortisol levels. This regulatory function of self-talk is incredibly important during times of pressure or uncertainty. In those moments, your internal dialogue acts like a switch that either escalates the stress response or helps contain and reduce it. Over time, consistent practice of calm and empowering self-talk conditions your brain and body to respond more adaptively to stress. You develop what psychologists call stress resilience, which doesn't mean you avoid stress, but rather that your recovery time is faster and your physiological responses are more balanced. This is crucial for maintaining cognitive clarity, emotional stability, and physical health. It's also worth noting that stress regulation through self-talk isn't only about language. The tone, rhythm, and breath associated with that inner voice also matter. When you speak to yourself in a slow, measured, and encouraging way, your breathing tends to follow that pattern, naturally engaging the vagus nerve. This nerve is a major component of the parasympathetic nervous system and plays a central role in regulating inflammation, heart rate variability, and overall calmness. So when you speak in a grounded, compassionate tone, even silently, you're not just changing your thoughts, you're engaging your body's built-in recovery mechanisms. This kind of self-talk can be especially powerful when integrated into daily rituals. For instance, beginning the day with statements like, "Today, I focus on what I can control," or "I meet challenges with calm and clarity," sets a physiological baseline for the nervous system. You are signaling to your brain and body that safety, intention, and self-leadership are present. Doing this consistently, even for a few days, starts to shift how your system perceives and responds to stressors throughout the day. You begin to notice that things which used to trigger intense stress feel more manageable and your ability to return to a calm state becomes stronger and quicker. Ultimately, calming self-talk is a tool for self-regulation, not just in theory but in biology. It provides a way to take control of your internal environment, reduce the harmful effects of chronic stress, and build a brain-body system that is more stable, resilient, and aligned with optimal functioning. Through repeated use of this technique, especially during emotionally charged moments, you train your nervous system to favor balance over chaos, recovery over reactivity, and clarity over confusion. These aren't abstract benefits. They are measurable, observable shifts in how you think, feel, and perform under pressure. Developing intentional self-talk is not simply about repeating motivational phrases. It is about creating a structured mental environment that supports behavioral consistency and long-term identity formation. The brain thrives on routine and responds exceptionally well to cues that signal safety, direction, and purpose. When you use consistent self-talk routines, particularly at key times in the day, such as when waking up, facing a challenge, or ending your day, you provide your brain with a sense of coherence. This coherence reduces mental clutter and creates a more stable cognitive framework for making decisions, managing emotions, and taking purposeful action. The goal is to create mental scaffolding, reliable thoughts and phrases that your mind can return to when uncertainty or chaos arise. Behavioral consistency doesn't emerge from discipline alone. It is built on clarity. If you are unclear on who you are becoming or why your actions matter, motivation will fluctuate and habits will falter. But when your internal dialogue reinforces a clear identity, such as, I'm the kind of person who follows through, or I value growth over comfort, you are more likely to act in alignment with that identity, even when conditions are less than ideal. This internal coherence between belief and behavior strengthens what psychologists refer to as self-concordance, the alignment of goals and actions with one's deeper values. The result is greater follow-through, less inner conflict, and a heightened sense of personal integrity. The brain encodes identity not just through memories and external feedback, but through repeated internal messages. In neuroscience, this is linked to what's called the default mode network, a set of brain regions that become active when you are not focused on the external world and instead are engaged in self-referential thought. The way you speak to yourself during these moments, whether you're reflecting, evaluating, or imagining, literally helps form the narrative of who you believe you are. When you repeat identity-based affirmations that are aligned with your values and goals, you are shaping this neural network in a way that makes that identity feel real and familiar. It becomes easier to act in accordance with it because your brain has already rehearsed it internally. Moreover, intentional self-talk helps you navigate setbacks without losing your sense of direction. It's common for people to break habits or miss targets and then fall into all or nothing thinking, believing that one misstep invalidates their progress. But self-talk like one step back doesn't erase all the steps forward, or this moment is part of the process, not the end of it, allows you to re-enter the behavior loop without unnecessary guilt or shame. This mental flexibility increases your persistence, allowing small failures to become learning moments rather than identity threats. When practiced consistently, even for just 4 days, intentional self-talk can begin to form a habit loop. The cue becomes any situation that requires action or reflection. The routine is the self-directed phrase or thought. The reward is the clarity, calm, or motivation you feel after the statement. This cycle, repeated multiple times a day, starts to automate itself, reducing the cognitive load required to make intentional choices. Instead of fighting for discipline in every moment, you begin to operate from a stable internal script, one that reinforces consistency, motivation, and purpose. The more your internal dialogue is built around a coherent identity and value system, the less energy you waste on indecision, self-doubt, or emotional spirals. You begin to respond rather than react, to lead rather than chase, and to live according to a mental framework that sustains you in both high and low moments. This is not the product of external motivation, but of deeply integrated internal architecture, created word by word, phrase by phrase, thought by thought. Through intentional, identity-based self-talk, you become the architect of your habits, the protector of your energy, and the author of your personal transformation.